Doc Hadley's mare was tied to the hail porch rail when I came in from the south pasture, and something in my chest went tight before I reached the steps. It was not the horse that unsettled me, it was the hour. Doc Hadley made his rounds in the morning, always had, and a man who changed his routine after 40 years of keeping it was a man delivering news that could not wait for daylight. I pulled my gloves off and stood at the bottom of the steps, listening. Through the window glass I could hear murmuring, the low, steady cadence of a doctor who has learned to speak gently without speaking softly. My father's voice was absent from the conversation, which meant he was either asleep or too tired to argue. Both possibilities frightened me in different ways. The door opened before I could decide whether to knock on my own front door, and Doc Hadley stepped onto the porch with his hat already in his hands. He was a small man with kind eyes and a nose that suggested a long and devoted friendship with whiskey, but his hands were steady and his gaze was direct, and I had never known him to waste a word or soften a truth past the point of honesty. "Emmett," he said, and the way he said my name told me everything the next 10 minutes would confirm. We sat on the porch steps because the kitchen felt too close, and the yard felt too open, and the steps were the kind of place where a man could hear difficult things without walls pressing in on him. Doc Hadley set his bag between his boots and looked out at the valley, giving me the courtesy of his shared horizon instead of eye contact. "His lungs are worse," he said. "The cough has settled deeper than it was a month ago, and the weight he has lost is not coming back. I can keep him comfortable. I can manage the pain with laudanum and keep the fever from climbing too high, but I cannot turn this around, Emmett. I want to be honest with you about that." I nodded, because nodding was something my body could do while the rest of me went very still. The valley below us was golden in the late afternoon, the bare white trunks of the aspens catching the last of the light, and it struck me as cruel that the world could look that beautiful while someone was telling you your father was dying. "How long?" I asked, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone standing a few feet behind me. Doc Hadley rubbed his thumb along the brim of his hat. "Winter is hard on lungs like his. If the cold comes early and stays, which it does more often than not in this valley, I would say you have until spring. Maybe less, maybe a little more if we are lucky and the weather is kind." He paused. "I'm sorry, son. I wish I had something better to offer you." Spring. The words sat between us like a stone dropped in still water, and I watched the ripples spread out through everything I had been telling myself. I had known. Some part of me had known since the night I sat beside his bed and listened to him speak to a woman who was not in the room. But knowing a thing in the quiet of your own mind and hearing it spoken aloud by a man who has spent 40 years learning the difference between hope and fact are not the same, and I was not prepared for how different they were. "He was a good man once, your father," Doc Hadley said, and his voice shifted into something older, something that belonged to a memory I was not part of. Strong, quick to laugh, had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. He shook his head slowly. What happened between him and Tom Dawson, it broke something that did not need breaking. I watched it happen. 2 men who were closer than brothers, and then one summer it all went sideways, and neither one of them ever came back from it. I looked at him. "What happened?" Doc Hadley met my eyes for the first time since sitting down, and I saw the careful calculation of a man deciding how much truth a person could carry on a day like this one. Whatever he weighed, he decided against the full measure. "That is a question for your father," he said quietly, "while you still have the chance to ask it." He picked up his bag and stood, settling his hat back on his head with the practiced motion of a man who had delivered this kind of news before and would deliver it again. At the bottom of the steps he turned back. "The laudanum, 10 drops, no more than twice a night.
If the cough brings blood, send Billy Ketchum for me, day or night. And Emmett," he waited until I looked at him, "do not try to carry this alone. That is the mistake your father made, and look where it got him." I watched him ride down the track toward town until the dust settled behind him and the valley was quiet again. I did not go inside. I could not. The house behind me held a man who was dying by inches, surrounded by unsent letters and locked rooms and a silence so deep it had become the walls themselves, and I was not ready to walk back into that silence knowing what I now knew. Instead, I walked down the porch steps, past the barn where Reverend watched me with his usual patient judgment, across the south pasture where the grass was brown and dry and crunched under my boots like old paper. I walked until I reached the fence line, and then I stopped because there was nowhere else to go. The shared fence stretched north and south along the boundary between our land and theirs, cedar posts and wire that my father and Thomas Dawson had driven into this ground together in a summer when they were young, and the future was something that happened to other people. Now the posts were gray and leaning, the wire patched and repatched so many times it looked like a wound that had been stitched by different hands across different years. And it occurred to me that the fence was the most honest thing either family had built. It showed exactly what time and neglect and unspoken grievances did to a thing that was once whole. I put my hands on the top wire and leaned into it, not hard enough to test the posts, but hard enough to feel something solid under my palms. The sun was low and the light was the color of old brass, and the mountains to the west were already losing their edges to shadow. Somewhere below me in the creek bottom a bird was calling, a single repeated note that sounded like a question nobody had answered. I thought about the letters in my father's desk, 7 of them tied with brown twine, addressed to a woman named M. Dawson, in handwriting that shook with feeling even after decades of silence. I thought about the photograph, 3 young people arm in arm, grinning like they had invented happiness and could not imagine it ending. I thought about his voice in the delirium, calling out to someone who was not there, saying, "Don't let her go like I did," to a son he did not recognize as his son. And I thought about what Doc Hadley had said. A good man once broke something that did not need breaking. Until spring, that was what I had. A handful of cold months to know my father, truly know him, before the knowing became the only thing left. And the terrible truth, the one I could feel pressing against the inside of my ribs like a second heartbeat, was that I was not sure I could reach him. 30 years of silence does not yield to 5 months of trying, and whatever wall he had built around the center of himself was mortared with a grief I was only beginning to understand the shape of. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough for the light to change and the cold to settle into my coat, and the bird in the creek bottom to stop asking its question. Long enough that when I finally looked up from the fence wire, the valley had gone blue and still, and the first stars were showing through the thin cloud above the eastern ridge. That was when I saw her. Clara was on the ridge trail, a quarter-mile east, sitting a bay mare at the edge of the tree line where the trail crests before dropping down toward the Dawson house. She was not riding toward me. She was not calling out or waving or doing any of the things a person does when they want to be noticed. She was simply there, visible against the darkening sky, steady and still as if she had been there for some time and intended to stay. I understood, in the way you understand something that bypasses language entirely and arrives in the body like warmth or weather, that she had seen me walking. She had watched me reach the fence and stop. She had decided not to cross, not to intrude, not to offer words that would only prove how small words are when set against the things that truly hurt. Instead, she had done the harder thing. She had stayed where I could see her, close enough to be present and far enough to let me be alone with what I was carrying. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for me since I came home. I raised one hand from the fence wire, not a wave, just a lift of the palm, an acknowledgement that I saw her and that it mattered. Across the distance, in the blue half-light of early evening, I saw her nod. Then she turned the mare south along the ridge and rode toward home, and I watched the shape of her disappear into the tree line until the only thing left was the distant glow of the Dawson Ranch lamp coming to life in the valley below. I stood at the fence a while longer. The cold was in my bones now, and my father was inside, and there were chores I had not finished, and the laudanum needed measuring, and the stove needed wood, and 100 small duties stood between me and the grief I was not ready to feel. But for a few more minutes I stayed, watching that lamp burn steady in the dark, and I let myself hold the two truths at once: that my father was dying, and that somewhere across the valley a woman I was not supposed to care about had stood on a ridge in the cold just so I would not have to stand at a fence alone.
The green Tennyson was in my coat pocket. I had carried it every day since she left it on the fence post, and I did not pretend any more that it was about poetry. I pressed my hand against it through the wool and felt the small weight of it, the worn spine and soft pages that her mother had held and she had held and now I held, a thread connecting 3 people across a distance that had nothing to do with miles. Then I went inside, because there was wood to split and laudanum to measure, and a father who needed me, even if he could not say so, and because Doc Hadley was right. The chance to ask was not forever. Nothing was.